Welcome to A Stranger, a Suitcase and a Story. I'm Anton van der Walt. This is a podcast about starting over. It is about what it takes to leave the familiar behind and the courage it takes to begin again in a land that isn't yet home. Together with my co-host Ben Liebenberg, we explore the untold stories of migration. Not just where people went, but why they left, what they held on to, and what they've had to let go. Each episode, we sit down with someone who's made that leap. Someone who's left behind not just places, but languages, careers, communities, and sometimes even parts of themselves. They share what called them forward, what nearly held them back, and what they've come to understand about identity, belonging, and starting again. Produced in partnership with Southern Crossings, a community for South Africans forging new lives in Australia, this podcast is a place to feel seen, heard, and understood. Because this isn't just about visas or paperwork. It's about identity, loss, hope, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life piece by piece. So wherever you are on your journey, arriving, settling, or still thinking about it, welcome. This is where stories connect us all.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This information to customers travelling on the land airways. Flight LA 800 approach Qantas 321 service to Auckland and Santiago.
You're listening to episode 30 of A Stranger, a Suitcase and a Story. And with me is my co-host Ben. Ben, are you ready for a really exciting pod tonight?
Yes, absolutely. I'm at home for a change, got no commitments, no rush, so I'm really just excited to sit back and have a chat with our guest Lawrence tonight.
Yeah, it's good. You know, I met Lawrence a while back and such a pleasant guy. So with our guest today is Lawrence Jackson. Lawrence was born in Johannesburg and arrived in Australia in 1982 when his family made the decision to leave South Africa due to political situation at the time and concerns for their safety and security. When they arrived in Sydney, they found something important, a small but welcoming South African expat community, which helped create a sense of belonging in those early years. What shaped Lawrence's most, though, goes further back, much further. He speaks about the relationships he grew up with in South Africa, particularly with people who worked at his home, who were very much part of the family. Those experiences instilled in him lasting a love for Africa and its cultures. His career has evolved in distinct phases. He began in the arts world working as an impresario, bringing South African talent to Australia, before moving into a second career in the not-for-profit and philanthropy sector, where he spent decades working in fundraising, strategy, and social impact. Today he works with a wide range of organizations across education, health, and community sectors, helping them think about how to build, grow, and create meaningful impact. This is a conversation about migration, identity, and the different paths a life can take over time. So welcome, Lawrence. Really stoked to have you here.
Well, thank you. I'm really honored and really looking forward to a great conversation.
So, Lawrence, what we want to do before we take you back to Johannesburg, and you know, Ben will take you back there in the first instance. I just want to talk a little bit about what we have in every episode. Lawrence, is what we call a suitcase moment. So we go back in some kind of history, especially, you know, relating to some historical event or something like that, that also informed in terms of the stuff that you do nowadays and the work that you do. And I, you know, came across this idea about benevolence and structure. And in Australia, in particular, organized giving has been around for more than 2 centuries. You know, I'm picking up on sort of the work that you do nowadays. One of the country's earliest charities, the Benevolent Society, was founded in 1813, providing relief to those in need through community and church-based support. For most of that time, philanthropy was local and largely informal. driven by relationships, belief systems, and immediate need. But in the late 20th century, something began to change. As institutions like universities, hospitals, and major charities grew in scale, they could no longer rely on goodwill alone. They began building formal fundraising functions, often called development, focused on long-term donor relationships, structured campaigns, and sustainable funding models. And by 1980s and 1990s, this had become a defined discipline, supported by national bodies like Philanthropy Australia and influenced by global models for strategic giving. So the nature of philanthropy evolved from community-based benevolence to structured strategic impact. And in that shift, a new kind of role emerged. People who didn't just support causes, but helped organizations think about how to build, grow, and sustain that support over time. And so, Lawrence, this is exactly where your career is in, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and I could talk about this for hours, but, just to reflect back to you how this evolved for me, as you mentioned at the start when you introduced me, this is a second career of sorts, and I didn't quite realize it at the time, but if I look back through the thread of what's brought me to this was this common sense of community. I've always been involved in different types of communities, and I became a community organizer. Now that had different applications in different ages and stages, and even before I formally entered the world of not-for-profit organizations and NGOs.
Yeah.
But that happened a little bit by accident, maybe a suitcase moment, if that's the reference, or sliding doors, or I think John Lennon said it really well, where there's this famous line of, life is what happens while you're making other plans. And, I always thought my destiny was meant to be, in the arts, media, entertainment. That was a world I was drawn to very strongly, through my student days, and spent my first decade and did get involved, as you said, bringing, South African talent and working on other South African shows and productions. And that sense of, that African spirit has been in my blood, pretty much since childhood, and I'm sure we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But to this world of fundraising and philanthropy, little bit by accident, when I was looking, to do something new and buy a house in an expensive city in Sydney, and maybe evolve from a fairly challenging sector, being the arts, which, when you're young and single and don't have dependents and Sydney mortgages and private school fees, a little bit easier. But when I needed to make that transition, I was offered a role, and excuse the pun, because it happened to be, a blind ad placed in the Sydney Morning Herald. That's in the days when, that's how you got jobs, before online and internet and Seek. But the pun is, it ended up being for a fabulous organisation called Today Vision Australia. Yeah. At the time, it was the Royal Blind Society of New South Wales. Okay. And I didn't know it at the time, but the role was advertised as, manager projects and special events. And I had this special events, arts sponsorship kind of background, which is probably why they had some interest in me. Yeah. But I was looking to do something new, and, they offered me this opportunity, and I just took to it like a duck to water. It was just a really good, connection for me, and it fitted my business skills. My background is, business training, both at undergraduate and, postgraduate MBA level, with specialization in marketing and promotion. And so that was a good toolbox, if you like, for the fundraiser, the development person. And I kind of went from there. So that's like 25 years ago. But to your point, Anton, there is a lot of need, unfortunately. Australia is a very blessed country, a very wealthy country. But, there's a lot of need and a lot of very worthy organisations. There are about 26,000 deductible gift recipient organisations, which is tax office speak for you can get a deduction on your donation. So there's a huge amount of competition. And as a result of that, a mini industry has been formed of people like me, who work professionally in building relationships, generating support, stewarding donors, guiding impact, and it's a niche of its own, sector of its own.
Yeah.
I didn't know it at the time, but I evolved from there, and I've now been doing it as an advisor and a consultant for 20 years this year. So that's my 25, 26 years doing that, professionally.
No, and that is just fantastic, and I think we'll return to that a little bit later, because what we want to try and do, is, and I'll give it over to Ben a bit to talk a little bit about in your earlier time, because it's always like this. Somewhere along the line, as we grow up, that informs us what we become as adults, what we become, and the things that we're interested in doing. Right, Ben?
As we said, there's it's definitely a journey, eh? It doesn't just happen overnight. And as you say, sometimes sliding door moments, you choose something without really choosing it. But somewhere when we grow up, something resonates, something happens to us, something sticks with what we did or how we grew up. So just getting to know you a little bit better. Tell us a little bit about Joburg, where you grew up, and, siblings, and how you grew up and what you enjoyed doing at the time.
Absolutely. So we grew up in Cyrildene in Johannesburg, lived virtually in the same house for most of our life. Actually, I lie. We actually lived in Lyndhurst, close to Glen Hazel, I think, for the first, maybe 18 months that I don't remember at all, but the rest was in Cyrildene. I'm the oldest of three sons, and attended Cyrildene Primary School. I then spent 2 years at Queen's in Bez Valley. I then spent 2 years at King David, the Jewish school in Linksfield, for 2 years, and then we left there. I was 16 when we left Australia. Sorry, when we left for Australia. And so, completed my school in Australia, but my formative years were in South Africa, and, I was a young adult already, and a lot of who I was came with me.
So how did you experience Johannesburg and the area and the schools and that kind of thing? Oh, what's your memories, the good and the bad?
Look, my memories are mostly really good. I think we had a really blessed upbringing. We lived a fantastic life. We were, for the most part, safe and secure until things started to, change in the mid to late 70s. And that was probably part of the prompt to, for my parents, not me. But yeah, look, I think we were really lucky to have the life we had and everything there. And I think we had a sense that things were not right and we were the privileged, and there was a huge group of people who weren't. And, as you've mentioned already, we had very close relationships with staff. They were servants, really, and they were like family, but they really worked for us, and we had a close bond with them. We didn't entirely understand as kids what was going on, but as the political situation intensified, and I'll tell you about a catalyst, and I think there's a lot of commonality in South Africans who've left. We were some of the voortrekkers, maybe, because we were in that early wave. But my mother was the oldest of four siblings, and she had two brothers, and her younger brother was in the army, and he was severely injured in a military accident where the armoured vehicle that they were in went over a landmine in Angola, and he was lucky that he survived. Other people in the truck didn't. And he was in military hospital in Pretoria recovering for a long time. And I remember as a probably 2-3 years before we came out. That was probably a turning point where I think that was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back. The situation was intensifying. Obviously, it started with Sharpeville, and then we had the 76 riots. I remember that vividly. I was 10 or 11 years old, but, I remember stories I heard from, a very good friend of mine who we grew up with. Father had their business where they delivered, cold drinks to the townships, and they were actually in the townships on the day. So we heard stories firsthand, but I think the catalyst was my mother seeing her brother, in this really difficult situation. Thank God he survived, and, for the large parts has been safe and well, and also migrated to Australia some years after us. But she didn't want her 3 sons to, go through that experience, and she was just fearful for us.
Right.
And I think that was the prompt that, kind of motivated them to leave us South Africa, chose Australia, and that's where we landed. We landed in Sydney.
What were your parents doing at the time? I mean, what was their vocation and their jobs and so on? What did they do?
My father trained as a lawyer at Wits, but he never practiced. He came from a first-generation Jewish migrant family, and most of them were business people and entrepreneurs. And his father was involved in scrap metal, so they had a scrap metal plant in Jeppe. That's where it started. And then my father did a few things, but joined his father in that business, which was actually named after him. It was called, his name was Herbert, or it was always known as Herbie.
Yeah.
Herbie Jackson was his name. And my grandfather called the business Herbert Metals after him. But then in time they expanded into like Hessian bags and set up a new plant in Wadeville, just the other side of Germiston. I remember growing up at both plants as a young kid,
Yes.
3, 4, 5, and then, kind of 5 to 10. He then evolved into commodities trading, and that's what he did when he came over here. He had always been self-employed, never worked for anything else. My mother didn't really work. She did a lot of charity work I remember her hosting events at our house for the Union of Jewish Women and organizations like that. She did work with him in South Africa in the commodities business, which he sold, and the company he sold it to were global, and they had an office in Australia. And that was part of our entry to Australia. Long story short, though, my father never really worked for anyone else, and it's not something he could do too easily. So he didn't last there too long. After about, maybe 6 months or so, he left and decided he'd go back into business, and he ended up buying a travel business, and he built up a travel business and did very well and learned a new world. And he was quite a character, my father, and sadly he passed away quite young. He had bowel cancer, and he passed away younger than I am now. So that was quite sad, but and it's been 27 years or so, but people still remember him, and he's always there with a smile and a joke, and he was a real personality. So, that's what my parents did, and that was our upbringing.
So just going back quickly, so you said you were about 16 years old when your parents made this decision, and at 16-year-old, we all know that's all can be a tough time between parents and children. So how did you feel when your parents said, "Look, we're packing up and going"? You must have had good friends there and settled and stuff. So how did you receive the news? Were you excited for the journey, or were you a bit apprehensive about it? How did you feel?
It was both, Ben. We definitely had mixed feelings. We'd grown up with a group of people so closely, from nursery school to primary school to high school, virtually in the same suburb. It was a beautiful suburb to grow up. But on the other hand, there was excitement of coming to a new country. We didn't know a lot about Australia. We knew they were pretty good at cricket, so played a bit of cricket. Although, my key passionate sport was soccer, football. I was a mad Highlands Park supporter. We grew up pretty much at Balfour Park. I don't think I missed a game. Loved rugby too, and I still love rugby.
Yes.
I really prefer rugby union to rugby league. I like rugby league, but it's just the game I grew up with, and we'd go a lot to, Loftus and, obviously
Ellis Park.
and all of that. But so there was excitement of coming over, but I was really lucky. I don't know if it was my, social nature and like of people and, mostly quite outgoing, but I really hit the ground running. You can't really plan these things, but I think it was, as, you mentioned at the start, there were a group of people who were here before us who'd come in the, 2, 3, 4 years before. Some people who came in the late 70s, the early 80s. We came at the end of 1982. And we were really met with open arms, and, some of the people we met within the few weeks of arriving are my friends to this very day,
Very
and
good.
we've, some were at school with us in the same year, some were above, some were below. I had a repeater year because I left the year just before I would have gone into my matric. I have a brother who's 16 months younger than us, so many people think we're twins. And then we have a Lamaki who's another, 8 years younger. So there was quite a gap between Vernon and myself and Alan. And so I ended up in the same year as Vernon because he was lucky. He had finished, the equivalent of standard 10. I'd finished, standard 11, would have gone into matric if I'm recalling correctly. At the time, I was very upset about that because I had a repeater year.
Yes.
And
with your brother too.
But, we're very different. We're very close, but we're very different. I'm arts and humanities and, kind of right brain. He's mathematics, engineering. He's an engineer, left brain. And, that worked really quite well. But then I stood back once I got over the shock, and I thought, well, I'm still a year ahead. I would have done 2 years in the army, so stop complaining and get on with it. But, really, I met some fantastic people. We came towards the end of the year. I remember we came I think it was the 2nd or 3rd of November, and there was this thing called the Melbourne Cup. We never heard of this, but this big horse race, and, the whole country stopped, and, it was kind of the time when, the school year was finishing. So we had we'd finished the year in South Africa, and we didn't start till, the beginning of February. So we had 3 months. So we met a lot of people really quickly. A group of people really took us under their wing, and literally within 4 to 6 weeks, I'd met 100 people and got into social circles, invited to events, and I absolutely loved it. And it was really exciting being here. So I was really lucky.
Well, that's fantastic, eh? And I think the fact that you had that infrastructure and that immediate infrastructure and that people looking after each other, I think still today that's something we can learn from that, And I think as the contingency of South Africans getting bigger, because, I came over in the 2000 and there weren't a lot of South Africans here. Admittedly, I wasn't in Sydney. We were in Adelaide, and I can tell you there weren't a lot of South Africans. You spotted the odd one with a South African accent, and people actually still ask you, hey, listen, that accent, where it's from, where today. Everybody knows what a South African accent sounds like in Australia. But the point that I just wanted to make, it mustn't be lost that having that infrastructure and looking after people when they come in, it can be so powerful, and it can mean such a lot because, it's not always easy when you do come and you don't have it.
Absolutely. And it actually continued when I started school because we moved on to the North Shore of Sydney. We first lived in Kalara, and then, when my parents, we rented a house initially, and then they bought a house in St Ives, or known as St Africa, and they're to this day, but, there was a very large cohort, and I told you about the schools I went to in South Africa, but I ended up going to 4 schools. I did 2 years at Kalara High, which was a fantastic school. You know, again, I was really welcomed by, you know, Australians. I found Australians, you know, very informal, warm, you know, easygoing. And there was a very big cohort of ex-South Africans there already. So, you know, from people I met over the summer holidays before I started school and then at school, I just had a soft landing and just went from there.
Yeah, that's wonderful. The thing that keeps on sitting in my head is the question is, why did your parents pick Australia? Do you know that answer?
I think I do, because I remember when they were considering this, you know, very seriously. I remember there used to be these series of like Thursday night conversations with other people who were in the same predicament. Some came and some went. And I remember my best friend who I grew up with, you know, in South Africa, who did end up coming as well. But my father and his father, as a result of these planning conversations we'd have informally, came out on, you know, a look-see, which I think is well known. And they actually went around Australia. This was maybe a year before we came, when, you know, they were putting in applications for residency. And I don't remember exactly where they went, because I would have been 14, 15 at the time, but I remember it quite vividly. And they went probably Perth, Melbourne, Sydney. And for some reason, my father liked Sydney and he chose Sydney. And it's probably as simple as that.
Yeah.
A good decision on one hand and challenging on others, because Sydney's a beautiful city, but, you know, not the cheapest in the world. So, you know, pros and cons. But I loved Sydney the minute we got here, and I was enamored with, you know, the beaches. We lived, you know, close to the northern beaches. We'd head down Monavale Road, and, you know, there were no beaches in Joburg, so this was something new. Of course, we had Durban and Cape Town, and, you know, we went all the holidays, and we were
9
very
hours away.
privileged and blessed, right? But it wasn't at our doorstep, 20 minutes down, you know. And then in university days, once I finished school, I went to University of New South Wales in Randwick, and I found myself, you know, heading over the bridge every day, and eventually it was a bit much going there, home, back out at evening. So I moved to Bondi with a, you know, school friend of mine who, you know, went to Kalara with, and we actually lived at Bondi Beach, you know,
wonderful.
in student days, and there we were. You know, it was pretty grubby there compared to how Bondi is today. It was, you know, but it was a amazing place to be. And so that's probably why I ended up in the eastern suburbs.
Right.
So I'd like to ask you, just because you've been one of those early arrivals in our era, in any case, what are the things in Australia from the time that you came in till today that you've seen either changed or progressed, or just, you know, some of the involvement that you've seen over the time?
So do you mean what I've seen change here in Australia, or what I've seen when I've gone back to South Africa?
Well, let's start with Australia. What did you see in Australia? You know, what are the things that you Ben,
experienced? I've been here like, you know, 40 years plus, so a long time.
Yeah.
You know, when we arrived, we used to send aerograms. You know, I had a box full of aerograms I used to write to, you know, school friends, family, my grandmother, and you know, I remember trying to make a phone call. To make a phone call, you know, was such a privileged thing. It was like
absolutely.
$100, you know, $100 or like $50 to make a phone call in 1982. That was a lot of money.
Yeah.
You know, we'd kind of save up our monies, and I'd ring a few friends or ring family, and, you know, you'd go to those Telstra call boxes that don't really exist anymore.
No.
You know, it's a completely new world. To think now, you know, a friend of mine actually said to me last year, who I went to school with, he was a year above me, ex-South African as well. And he said, "You're a very social person at school. We could never keep up with you. And I remember you saying that the one thing you wished for, I can't remember this at all, is to have free phone calls that could be made one day anywhere around the world, so you could keep up with people. And that's
Well,
what
there
a
you
friend
go.
of mine, his name is David
Yeah.
Boehner. She lives in Dallas now. And I said, did I really say that, David? That's amazing. We take for
Yeah.
granted WhatsApp and
Yeah.
FaceTime and
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of this. So there've been
Yeah.
such enormous changes,
No,
Ben,
so
over
true.
these
I
years.
think, yeah, that's just so true. Even the little, I haven't been there that long, but certainly that's one of the things, just your ability to connect and stay in touch, and the cost, I think we've all got stories about, how we contacted, or I contacted Australia for a job, and was still, you had to choose, plug out the telephone, and you had this big beeping noise and send a fax and all those things. But yeah, the
All
communication
those
certainly
days.
it made it so much easier to connect and stay connected, and with WhatsApp's groups, stay connected with people, and I suppose Facebook, all the social media stuff. We hear a lot about the negatives about them, but there's certainly some positives around them as well.
Yeah, look, there are pros and cons, but if you think of the ability to connect, find people around the world almost in an instant,
Right.
whereas before, there were people you would never find again because you just didn't have a means to contact them. It's just extraordinary what's possible, and there's no excuse not to keep in touch. You can do it for free every day.
I say
Without even
I
noticing.
say exactly that to my sisters who still live in South Africa, and I say to them that you don't have to worry about spending money to call me, right? It's like you can actually just do it on WhatsApp. It's very easy. And so you're right. I think we forget. We still sometimes think it's you're in a different country, so it's harder.
I think you're right, Anton. We do, and I'm guilty of that myself. But every now and then, I try to ring my cousins. I still got a lot of family in South Africa, which is one of the reasons I like going back as much as I can, as well as in recent years working with some South African institutions, schools, universities, think tanks, which has added another dimension to me. But and we all have family and friends around the world, like any South African would have in the South African diaspora. And
Yeah.
at the end of the weeks or on special holidays, it is nice to try and make those calls or at least send messages, and it is amazing how you can keep in touch.
And so, are you
yeah.
still connected to South Africans or in South Africa?
I am, because I have first cousins on both sides who still live there, and in fact, my maternal grandfather passed away quite young, and so my grandmother remarried when I was still quite young, probably about 5 or 6. And so we grew up with another set of like step cousins who are like our real cousins. So we have 3 sets of cousins, and they're all over the world, but a bunch of them on all 3 sides, if you like, are there. So
Wow.
whenever I go back, I try really hard to
Connect
catch up with them, and I do. And again, before key festivals and events, Jewish holidays, Jewish New Year, and not as much as we'd like, but it's we have the means to do that. And I've got a soft landing when I'm there because I've got lots of places to stay, and very welcoming homes. So
Good food and so on. Yes.
absolutely. And in previous years, I'd only get back, when we were first here, I used to go as often as I can, every couple of years or so. But then you realize that there's a whole wide world out there, and you've got to go to other places. And so, that period between visits would increase. But as I said, in recent years, I've had the opportunity for my consultancy to, and particularly after COVID, where the world became very global. And as you know, because I think we've met at some of these events, I've had the opportunity to, work with, as I said, institutions, mostly Wits University, which has been a great honor and privilege. And through that, it gets me back there every year or two. And it's really great to do that. I only wish I could go for longer.
Take us a little bit to your first career. How did you end up doing that in the entertainment world, and why did you do that?
Great question. Again, a little bit by accident. When I was growing up, I probably had this vague notion, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do, that, I'd do something related to business and possibly law. So the plan was to do like commerce law, and, I ventured down that path, and I had a choice to go to the University of New South Wales, which was much harder to get into. So I got into a commerce degree, but that's where the social scene was. So I got drawn towards that, and where a lot of my friends and the community were, or to do something, kind of a combined degree at another institution. So I went down the business commerce path, and while I was doing that, I got very involved in student life, student activities, and I was involved in many of the Jewish student organizations, and my first role was as the social officer, and part of the portfolio was to organize social activities, to put on things that would build networks and draw students into fun activities. But as I did that, I got more drawn into it, and I ended up becoming the president of the University of New South Wales Union of Jewish Students, and a year later I was, encouraged to, put my hand up for the president of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students, which was, the roof body of, all the Jewish student societies around the country. And as a result of that, I, became a co-vice president of the World Union of Jewish Students, because there was a union of countries around the world, including, the USA, Canada, UK, South Africa, Australia, Europe. And there was a base out of Israel, and all the, country presidents became co-vice presidents. And this was a whole new world to me. And I was traveling to Israel fairly regularly to represent Australasia. It was mostly Australia, but we did include New Zealand. And I got involved in political activism and, human rights causes, and fighting for Soviet Jewry, because it's a whole other life. But to answer your question about entertainment, it was actually at the end of the year, this usual Australian schoolies thing, where you go up to the Gold Coast at schoolies. And I went up to the Gold Coast with, my friend Eric, who was my best friend from South Africa, who I told you the story about our fathers coming out and doing that. And he was out here on a visit. He hadn't migrated here yet. He, came many years later, but we went up and stayed with some, Queenslanders I'd met through my kind of social groups. And they took me into the Surfers Paradise Beer Garden to, kind of get into the spirit of Schoolies Week. And there was this incredible performer, and many people would know him because he was iconic on the Gold Coast and Schoolies in the, late 80s, early 90s, which was kind of the time, called Hemi. And he was a entertainer par excellence, and he just had the whole Surfers Paradise Beer Garden in rapture, and it was really engaging, and we got to meet him, and I struck up a real bond and rapport with him. And I said to him, Hemi, you got to come to Sydney, you're amazing. So I brought him down for some student social events, because that was my portfolio, and he was a real hit on campus, and he loved Sydney, and Sydney was a great market for him. And I then brought him down when I finished university as a bit of an entrepreneur, because I saw an opportunity to experiment. So we started putting on, pub shows with him and making some money and having a good time. And that's what got me into entertainment and show business. And
amazing.
Through Hemi, I met some other people, and I got asked to do, roles working for other promoters who were doing all sorts of things. But to come back to my South African story and my connection to African culture, which was in my blood, I always had that, love of African music, and, we grew up with it, played on the radio in the backyard by our staff, right? By our maids.
Yeah.
And it just something that always stuck with me. And so, I met a promoter. He sadly passed away quite young, but he was the promoter out of Central Casting. His name was Peter Corder, and he wasn't South African, but he knew a lot of South Africans. He was very charismatic, and he too loved world music. So he brought out a lot of world music performers, some of whom were South Africa, but many from Africa as well, including some incredible performers like Yusu Ndua, Salif Keita. These are iconic names. But he brought out Ipitombi. So he, did that. I wasn't directly involved in that, but I went to that, and he brought out Lucky Dube, the reggae star.
Yeah.
And he brought out Malatini and the Malatela Queens. So these were like extraordinary African
acts,
performers. And he asked me to work with him on them. So, I cut my teeth, helping him co-promote and co-produce them. He took the risk on them. That was his thing, but that was my learning curve. And I'd always loved Mango Groove. And so I listened to Mango Groove. And so then he planted a seed, and I thought, well, could I get Mango Groove out here? And
no, did you?
So with
very good.
help from friends, and wasn't easy, but I approached them, and they were willing to come, and so I did Mango Groove tour of Australia in, I think it was 1991, and learned a lot from it. But we filled up the Enmore Theatre, and went to Melbourne, Canberra, Perth, and so on and so forth, and some others. So that was my life in arts and entertainment. But I work quite broadly across comedy and cabaret. I always loved comedy and stand-up comedy, and still did. And it was a lot more economic, because with comedy you got man or woman microphone light. It's one person, and you can charge $16 at the time for a show. Today you could probably charge $56 or more. And you only had to kind of, have that kind of technical setup. For a whole band, you could maybe charge like $25, but you had 5 people and a whole, technical crew and a bump in and a bump out. So, as a young promoter, that's kind of how I made a living, and found a few performers who I gelled really well with and toured them around the country and a little bit broader. And that got me into theatre as well. So I've done some work in theatre, small theatre shows, working with some amazing people. And even to this day, I got involved in Mandela the Musical, which is current, and it's actually been developed by, 2 amazing Joburgers who went to King David, although, many years after me, called Greg and Sean Borofsky. And they've developed the script. They got the rights from the Mandela family. I helped them, to raise a bit of money, but they raised most of it themselves. And anyone who raises money for a musical, is kind of part of the production crew. So you become one of the many producers. And so I went for the out-of-town run-in in London, which was great. And they're now, reworkshopping the show, and it's been many years in development. And the big goal is to get it onto Broadway. So I hope they do, and it makes life more interesting, that's for sure.
No, it is. Well, that's a fascinating. I mean, that has been fantastic for for the type of person that you are. You're a community person, very outgoing, and then you go follow that, but you say that at some point then you wanted to do something else. But there's something else, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, but there's something else that you now go and do, which you did for the last 25 years. It's very similar in nature than the entertainment industry, because you got to work hard to raise funds and get people involved in a cause, right?
Absolutely. And there were elements of that I was doing in that first career, if you like, in raising sponsorship and raising funds to put on shows. But, I started, as I told you, a little bit through university, just by, meeting someone, doing one show, leading to another, meeting someone, then graduating and needing to go get a job. And I've always been quite independent and entrepreneurial. I got that from my father and my grandfather. And so I've always gravitated towards, doing my own thing.
Mm.
I have done full-time serious management roles, and I've done several full-time and many interim roles. So I've done that too. But I actually started almost the inverse of most people. Most people start in a big firm in a junior role, and they build themselves, they build up the career ladder over time, and then they go into middle and senior roles, and they may evolve out of that. I did the opposite. Maybe not the best strategic planning, but I kind of followed my heart. And,
Yes.
So in the first decade or so, I was single. I didn't have any responsibilities, but, as life evolves and you get married and then you have to buy a house and, no kids, and then kids arrive, you've got to kind of get serious. So I thought, the showbiz world's a lot of fun, but, I got to get a real job. And it was tough. I got to be honest. I loved it, but when you're putting on shows, you'll make money and then you'll lose money and you'll make money, and you've got to be a risk taker. And I was willing to do that, but in a responsible way. I never wanted to risk more money than I can afford to lose, and I never wanted to bet the farm on everything. I didn't want to put my house on the line every time. Not that I had a house then. So I thought, well, look, let me try something else for a while, establish myself, and then I'll come back to it. That was kind of my plan. So I went back to, beloved University of New South Wales. I did an MBA at the Australian Graduate School of Management, which I absolutely loved, by the way. And it, developed a real affinity for universities in general and business schools in particular. And when I came out of that, I thought I'd, like most freshly minted MBAs, I'd go into corporate or consulting or banking or something like that. And so when I went out to meet the world, they kind of looked at me a little bit oddly because I didn't have that, kind of corporate trajectory. But as I told you already, that story, there was a role that was advertised in the Sydney Morning Herald. I applied for it, and, they offered me the role. And when they told me that it was an NGO that was helping people, it appealed to me,
Yes.
Enormously. I didn't realize it at the time, but I've always been communally wired, and I've always been involved in the community and done all sorts of roles. So I thought, well, I needed a job. They offered me a job. It was, pretty good opportunity. And I felt I was doing some good in the world. So what was not to like? And it was fantastic. So that's where I started. But, after 7-8 years, I got a little bit impatient, and I thought I better get back to what I thought I was meant to be doing, which was this, producer world. And my plan was probably more to get into probably media and production, television, film.
Yes.
I didn't go to film school, so I didn't have that background. That's not something that I kind of dawned on in, probably earlier days. But as the production bug, kind of, developed within me, I thought that would be maybe a commercially savvy way to, evolve into this world. But, as I started, making entrees into that world, and I did produce some, small documentaries for the ABC on radio, not on television, and I got involved in a few documentaries. But, after the work I'd done in the fundraising world and the NGO world, whilst I was, trying to establish myself back into this, producer world, people just kept coming to me with, projects and things they wanted me to do. And one thing led to another. And, they were all energizing, and they were all, good work to be done. And, some of them were, quite good consulting opportunities for really great organizations, even in my early years, like, Multiple Sclerosis Society and the University of Sydney and, the Heart Foundation and so on and so forth. And these were, iconic organizations. Vision Australia again. I started there, and, I got asked to go back there and do another project. They had evolved considerably, and, that kind of just kept going. And so after 2 or 3 years, I kind of just resigned myself, and I said,
this
this is clearly what the world wants me to do for now.
Let's
It's serving me well, so I'll just stick with it. And then later.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Wits now. So now's the right time. So I met you at a Wits business lunch together with Southern Crossings, and so talk to us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Wits. I think you told me that you never went to Wits, right?
So I'll tell you the Wits story, because
Yes.
it's a great story, and I've been working very closely with Wits for 5 years now, and in fact just got a call with them before we jumped on this call, and have a webinar with them tomorrow night. So it's very, very, very current. But let me just backtrack to kind of universities, because when I did my MBA, I said already that I loved that experience, and I actually ended up doing a lot of facilitating and tutoring. I actually started at UTS, and I taught a course there in marketing for the arts, because I had 10 years experience in the arts, and they were looking for a tutor, if you like. And I really enjoyed it, and I got, good feedback from the students, and I did something similarly in their leisure services school. And I then went back to where I did my MBA at the AGSM, and I did the part-time program there, which was called the Executive MBA. And the way it's delivered is a facilitated delivery model. So they use adjunct faculty is their fancy word for it, but it's really industry tutors. And so I showed them, the feedback I got, and they took me on there, and I did a lot of intensive, work for the AGSM, so these are evening classes. So, I had this full-time role at, what became Vision Australia, and I taught marketing principles and then organizational behavior, and absolutely loved it, and developed a lifelong love for business schools and a real value for education. So put that aside, forward fast a few years, and I was doing work, in the not-for-profit space around some of the relationships I had from the full-time roles that I held. I did these 3 full-time roles starting again at a funding development manager at the Blind Society, then the Benevolent Society. But while I was there, I was tapped on the shoulder to put my hand up for a role as CEO of a Jewish Community Foundation in Sydney called the JCA. And that was a fantastic role, and I got to work with some extraordinary people, and met some great networks and contacts, many of whom are, still relationships, I leverage to this day, and has led to many client engagements again to this day. But out of the blue, I got a call from a headhunter, and I'll tell you the story very quickly, and sorry if I'm going on a little bit, but it was the end of my first year as a contractor, while I was still balancing, thinking that I'm trying to get into producing, but I was doing this, what I thought was freelance work, but it was like building up. And I just did something in a mentoring program over in Perth for the West Australian Ballet, of all organisations. It wasn't a major engagement, but I remember I just arrived back into Sydney. It was just before Christmas. I think I was in a taxi home from the airport, and my phone rings, and it was a recruiter saying, "Hi, Lawrence, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I've got a portfolio of different, not-for-profit projects." And they said, "Yeah, well, we've got an interim management assignment that we'd like to talk to you about. Can you come to our offices on Monday morning?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." They said, "We can't tell you what it is, but, we'll let you know then." So I thought, okay, well, sounds interesting. I don't know what interim management is, but I turned up there, and they said, "We've got 3 different state chapters of the Multiple Sclerosis Society are merging together, and we need someone just to hold the fort while we recruit a fundraising manager, so that, business as usual can continue, and the staff are supported and all of that. And we need you for 6 weeks, and we're going to, it's a good contract." So I thought, okay, well, that would be a good thing to do. Nice block of work, and I can move my other things around. So I did that and I loved it. They were a great organization and I really enjoyed working with them. But, it's never 6 weeks. The 6 weeks became 7 months,
Yes.
right? Or if they say 1 year, it usually becomes 2 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed working for them. And then at the time that they were appointing this manager, they said, look, you could put your hand up for the role because, you'd be a contender for it. You've done a good job for us. But actually, we'd like to talk to you about something else. And again, you'll have to come and, come to the office. And so I turn up at the office and I meet Professor Andrew Coates, his Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Sydney. Somehow he'd heard about me and he wanted me to come on board to do a 1-year contract as head of university campaigns. They were planning a major philanthropy campaign, and Andrew was a really iconic, bold thinker. He's a cardiologist from Melbourne who had built his career at Oxford University, so one of the leading universities in the world. They had undertaken a £1 to £2 billion philanthropy campaign. It was called the Oxford Thinking Campaign. And Andrew had seen what they achieved, and he thought the same was possible in Australia.
Wow.
And so, he got a very senior position, and he was responsible for alumni, institutional marketing, and philanthropy development. And to be fair to the University of Sydney, they had done a lot of great work over decades to try and develop and apply some of the North American philanthropy campaign techniques, which were the most advanced in the world. And so Andrew had this vision for a massive campaign. He needed someone to help, plan and prepare for it. So they offered me this 1-year contract at the University of Sydney. The reason I told you the story about education is because I always believed that education is a leveler in society and a real opportunity for those who, face disadvantage to, try and, kind of catch up. And so that appealed to me. But at the time, there wasn't a tradition of big ticket philanthropy to universities. My background had been in charities, right? And there was a very well-established charity sector with lots of loyal individual donors. And that's the world that, I'd come out of for 7 or 8 years. But Andrew was very persuasive and it was a good contract and I believed in education. So I did think to myself, who's going to give money to university? We were very privileged in Australia, especially in my days, but even now where education, was virtually free. It's not today. And that we have this, high education HEC scheme, which is somewhat fair, but I think, somewhat challenging to a generation who have a lot of burden to break into the property market and pay for education. So I do feel enormously for them, and that's why I've driven to do work to try and...
So how did that... I didn't want to leave the VIT story out there. So how does this...
Sorry.
No,
let me get to the VIT story. So that was my entree to universities.
Yes.
And so I came on board at the University of Sydney and I loved that role. I loved working there, and I really took to the possibilities of what philanthropy can do to, reduce barriers, fund research, and, equip universities to create real impact. So that was where I started. As I said, the 1 year ended up being a second year. I was asked to be the interim head of the, fundraising office for a while the University of Sydney were planning, a campaign, which they did. And the quiet phase of it happened while I was there, but it was launched publicly a few years later. It was called Inspired the Campaign for the University of Sydney, and it revolutionized the practice of fundraising in Australia and became the first campaign to raise $1 billion in Australia.
That's
so it was
amazing.
a phenomenal campaign, and I was really lucky. I was there at the right place at the right time. I just got the call. Maybe I was, savvy enough to say, this is something I could check out. What have I got to lose? So from working at the University of Sydney, I had opportunities to work with several other universities over about 5 or 6 years. And subsequently, I worked for kind of 10 universities around the world. But the VIT story kind of happened a little bit like this. And it was kind of like Well, I won't ruin it, but very quickly, back to family, right? I booked to go to South Africa for the last bar mitzvah of the cousins. So of my first cousins, immediate first cousins, this was the last bar mitzvah of all, the kids left. So my brother and I had booked to go, and, we booked in late 2019. This was happening, in March 2020. And we were really excited, and literally a month before, 4 or 5 weeks before we were set to go, I was at a boardroom lunch for, another charity. It was hosted by Pengana Capital, who, have a very generous program. Carol Pellimer was the host there, and I was sitting next to someone who was a Wits academic who'd come out to Sydney to, see his sister who lived here. So we chatted, and, I asked him what he did, and he said he's, got this role at Wits. And I said, well, I've done a lot of work for universities and I'm coming to South Africa soon. And he said, well, you have to visit us at Wits. I said, so this brings me to my Wits story. So I said to him, literally, I said, I'd love to. Wits is my university that I never went to. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, my father went to Wits, my uncle went to Wits. Had I stayed in South Africa, I would almost certainly have gone to Wits.
Yes.
But I didn't have the opportunity. My parents, decided we were leaving. I was 16, and I finished all my school in Australia and did all my university in Australia. He said, well, come and visit us. You've got great experience working with Australian universities. I'm sure our alumni and development people would love to meet you. And I said, great, I'd love to. I kind of forgot about it. And 2 days later, I gave him my card. And 2 days later, an email, enters into my inbox from a fellow called Peter Bezatenhout, who, is the head of the fundraising and development office at Wits, is to this day. And I just had a call with him literally, an hour ago. And Peter said, we'd love to welcome you at Wits, and, we'd arrange a time to meet. And they said, come and we'll give you a tour and we'll go for lunch to the Wits Club. And I thought, great, fantastic. Anyway, long story short, this thing called COVID happened, borders closed, never went anywhere. But we got on a Zoom call. And like we're having on this call, doesn't matter whether you left, 40 years ago or, 4 years ago. You connect with South Africans in an instant, into a heartbeat, and we struck up a rapport and, started, sharing some experiences. Then Peter said to me, well, we have a huge, base in Australia. We think we've got 6, 7, 8,000 alumni. We don't know exactly because we lose contact, but we do have a database of many. We come out every second year with the Vice Chancellor and the alumni, manager, and we do events to reconnect, but we don't have anyone on the ground. Do you think you could help us? So I said, I don't know, maybe. What do you want me to do? And it started from there. So we went in stages, but within a short amount of time, I was able to use my contacts and realize that we could set up through the Australian Tax Office and the Australian Charities Commission 2 foundations that would be tax deductible in Australia for Australians to support Wits in 2 core areas. One was scholarships and bursary support across all faculties, and the other was in public health and medical research. So those were the 2 areas we could establish relatively easily, and I knew who to go to. And within 3-4 months, we had these foundations up and running, and we launched Wits Australia, softly through COVID. We couldn't meet because, we were in lockdown, but we used webinars, and webinars were, cost effective and really powerful. So we launched Wits Australia, this incarnation of it, on the back of webinars. And then soon as, life returned to normal, then we were able to do in-person events, and we evolved and grown from there all around the country. And we have chapters now, as you know, in, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, and in-person events and an alumni program. And
oh, that's wonderful. We as you probably know, the last event, before we kind of go to other things, but the last event that we had that I was present with the Wits business luncheon, and there were, I don't know, 200 people in the room, and there were Lawrence was the MC, and then there were 3 speakers, and the 3 speakers were Dr. Manny Paul AM, which we've had on this podcast, Dr. Jenny Gray AM that we had on the podcast, and Tim Netcher that we also have had on the podcast, and now we've had Lawrence as well. And so I think Lawrence Wits is now well represented on this podcast, that's for sure. And some fabulous people.
That warms my heart. You
Yeah.
know, this is a core client and project for ours, and it's part of the the reconnection, as I've said, and you bond really quickly. But I think our South Africans, if I could be bold enough to say, I think we punch above our weight, here and around the world. I think, as we said at the beginning of this call, we were pretty blessed, and we were privileged. And there was a group of South Africans who weren't privileged, and that's not lost on me. But we got a very good education, and that served us really well. And South Africans have, achieved at extraordinary levels. And, the quality of people I meet through the Wits network and the Southern Crossings network. And as you know, Anton and Ben, we partnered with Southern Crossings, which I think led me to meet both of you.
Yes.
On both those events. You came to last year's event, but we actually pioneered that, tested it, if you like, the year before in November 2024. I was determined to track Gail Kelly down because I was always a huge fan. I'd read her book, and Gail was extraordinary, and she's a really busy lady to this day. But once I got to meet her, which is actually through her husband Alan.
Yes.
Ironically, Alan is a medical specialist, and we did a medical specialist event that someone hosted on a Sunday morning. So Gail came along as Alan's handbag, actually, to this medical event. So I got to meet Gail there, and there were all these medicos, and it was a great Sunday morning brunch at a lovely home on the harbour. And, we were able to establish a bit of rapport. We had a few emails we exchanged over a year or two. I was quite persistent. And then I struck up the courage to say, Gail, would you consider speaking at an event for us? And she was really warm and said, my diary's challenging, but if we planned further out, I'd be, honored
wonderful
to do it. And she was so gracious. And so, we worked about, probably 10 to 12 months ahead, and, reached out to Hein Vogel at, Southern Crossings, and just to, boost up the numbers. And, we had some great sponsors who, backed us at those events. I don't want to leave someone out, so I won't try and remember them all on the run. But, having Gail as your inaugural guest speaker is a really strong, proposition. And so we launched on Gail. And then last year we had this amazing, panel of those 3. But the quality of Wits and South African graduates, not just Wits graduates, there are many great institutions and universities. Is extraordinary. And so, I get to meet some and work with some amazing people.
Yeah, and I think that's, we've done a wonderful conversation here. You can't imagine that we've gone through this already, and you're an amazing person. But I think the one thing that kind of struck me a little bit is the fact that you've never forgotten your roots. It's very clear that your upbringing is what you are today, and that's brought you here. But also, the fact that you care about South Africa, that you still do things, especially through, because you can, and you worked with universities. Then you say, well, there's a good idea we can do that through Wits, because there must be a great need for that sort of thing anyway. And that's wonderful. And, we can talk for hours, as you said in the beginning, but it's wonderful to hear your stories. I think what is so interesting is the fact that you've had such a varied career in different things that you did, but there's sort of a common thread through this, and it's people, community, philanthropy, caring about those sort of things. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, thank you. It's really great to, hear that mirrored back to me. But if I can say one more thing, and, I've heard myself say this to, people over the years, that I don't want to be one of these South Africans who, arrived here on the Wednesday and, bought their Wallaby jersey on the Thursday and, washed their hands of South Africa on the Friday. Look, I love Australia. It's a fantastic country. We're blessed to be here, and I'm a proud Australian, but I haven't forgot my roots, and it's a difficult balance of identity, but, there's something innate in me which goes back to all of that, and
It goes back to that music that you were hearing in your
so.
garden from from the staff that you had there, and playing that music, and you can hear it today if you.
I think so.
Okay.
And look, some of my friends don't understand it, and they've moved on, and I respect whatever people decide for themselves. But I tell you what, I went to the Springboks game in Perth last year, and that's like a home game.
Yes,
Yeah.
it
And if
was.
you've ever been there, all the Sandgropers listening to this call will know that.
Yes, yes.
It was kind of funny. I was there in my Springbok jersey, and my son was there because, they Aussies in his,
It is.
Wallaby jersey, and it didn't really matter. But I can tell you who was outnumbered.
Yeah,
That was
that's
the
right.
Australians. It was like
Yeah.
a home game. It was amazing. So there you go.
But talking about Australia, I don't want to just make this remark, because we came over as I said, in the early 2000s. Then my wife's sister came over, and the one thing we spoke about a lot, and we probably observed here more than we did in South Africa. Maybe we weren't there in June, but the Australians are extremely generous when it comes to supporting causes. And, we were just at the time, the Glenn McGrath test start, and, they'll have, I remember when we came here, there were some really bad bushfires in just on the eastern side of Melbourne out there, and how people will just donate and really back causes and back those things, and that's something that really struck us. We spoke a lot about Australians that's just really, really prepared to help and give money when there's need, and I thought I'll just bounce it off you because you live it, and you see it every day.
There's no doubt, Ben, and as I said, there's a whole mechanism in place that facilitates this, and it wouldn't exist if there wasn't enormous generosity. And it's inspiring sometimes to see when there are terrible tragedies in the world, and the response that happens repeatedly. You can think of examples over time, like when the tsunami happened and the bushfires, and you mentioned the McGrath Foundation, the amount of money they raised at the Sydney test, and how that test is unique in the world. Nowhere else is there a test like that anywhere. It's just extraordinary. So I think there is something, really special about it, Australian kindness and generosity. We give in different ways to the Americans. We are a blessed country, the lucky country maybe, although I know maybe the intention of that book was not quite how it's understood, but for the most part, despite many challenges of, our kids trying to, keep up, and as I've said already, get into, the property market and all of that, but first world problems, right? When we compare ourselves, and I think that sense of opportunity that we all have motivates a lot of people to give something back at different stages of life, and it's something that's driven me in the 25, 26 years I've been involved in the sector.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
Fantastic. I must say, it's one of the things that made me personally like an affinity with Australia, and also be proud to be an Australian, because I became an Australian soon after we've landed here. So I've been it for a lot of years, and the generosity and how they support these things, it is something to be proud of.
No, that's true. You're right, Ben. Lawrence, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. As I say, we can talk for a long, long time, but you've got some really interesting stories. And, the The Mango Groove story is the one I like the most because I like them too. I really loved them. We went to go and see them. I think it was Ben in Sun City at the time, right? So all those years ago, and so. But thank you for the time, and thank you for sharing your early life with us and what drove you and the things that you're passionate about. It's just been a fascinating story, and thank you so much, Lawrence. Really appreciate it.
Well, my thanks to you. It's been a real pleasure, and well done on this terrific podcast series that you've created. And thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really humbled.